So what I want to talk today about is really about how to get value from your board. And if you've got any particular questions, anything that I don't talk about, then please put a question in the question box or add something in the chat. I've got a colleague of mine helping monitor the chat and the questions, so hopefully we won't miss anything important. Centurion, welcome. Welcome, Bertie. Great, well, let's get into it. So I love this phrase because I think this is really what drives what I do. So I'm Tim Holmes, Head of Sales, Senior Partner at Sirdar, and I've been with Sirdar since 2013, originally from the UK, and came to South Africa in 1992. And I've got no inclination to go back to very cold and wet England, or anywhere else for that matter. Sirdar, the name comes from the name for the lead Sherpa on a mountain expedition. So you may see some images of mountains and mountain climbers along the journey today. And the idea is that the Sirdar helps lead the team to conquer their goal or climb their mountain. And it's all about the preparation at the base camp, making sure you've chosen the right route, and then make sure you've got the right equipment so that you can get to the summit and achieve your goal. And business is very similar in that you need to set a goal. How big a mountain do you want to climb? How big a business do you want to build? And what we'll be talking a little bit about today is for a bigger business, then you definitely need to start thinking about whether you've got the right board to help and support you, the right team to help and support you to get there. And this point about good directors grow companies and great directors change lives, I think is becoming more and more critical. So often we hear in the press about bad governance, and the directors should know better. They should know what best practice is. They should have the skills and abilities to lead that company, lead that board, and not make dumb mistakes or the deliberate mistakes that they have made, and which are either illegal or destructive to the company and all of the different entities and people that are impacted by that company. So if you have great directors, you can really leverage this thing called a business. This juristic person can then go out and make a massive difference in the world and impact positively all of the different stakeholders, whether staff, suppliers, clients, the environment, the community, all of those things. If you've got a successful business operating at its best, then you can really have a huge impact and, as I said, change lives. So this is really just referring back to a previous webinar I did, just because I'm not going to be covering this stuff in any great detail, but I did in a webinar I did on the 20th of January. For those of you can just please put that link in for that greatest fear video. So we did one in January and we did one in December, and the basic concept was really talking about what are those fears that people have as founders and business owners. I was inverted commas because you're not an owner of a business, you are a shareholder manager, but it's anyone who's been a founder, who's an entrepreneur. Typically they have fears of bringing in a board, and the three that came up most often were fear of control or loss of control, fear of the unknown, so not knowing what this whole governance thing was about and what this board was for, and it's all very scary. And the one that came out strongest was very much high cost, low value of non-exec directors, which in our world, in Sirdar's world, is a misconception. So what I want to try and talk about today is how you get value from a board. When would you need one? And once you've got one, then what do you do with it? So go back, watch that that webinar to fill in the details on what else we talked about. Otherwise, we'll continue with the focus specifically on how do you get value from a board today. So just a quick sort of really to check in on whether you have a board or not now and how it works. So the particular things I'm looking for are, for those of you can just put that poll up or launch the poll. If you don't have a board, then that's fine. And I know quite a lot of the call said that you were on this call to find out a little bit more about growing your career and what non-exec director opportunities might look like. So let me know, or let us know. If you don't have a board, that's great. It gives you a good indication of who's in the room. If you do have a board, but it's all shareholders and executives, in other words, there's no non-exec directors, There's no one who's not intricately or intimately involved with the business in some way. They've either put investment in or they're managing it. And the third one is really a distinction where the board is all executives. So there aren't any shareholders at all. And then I'm expecting that to be quite a small number of you, but it's always good to see where those of you are in that situation. And then if you've got anyone who's on a board, serving on a board, or runs a company that has a board where you have both non-exec directors and executive directors, then that's great, because now we can help you and describe to you what value might look like. And if there's anyone who had other, be interesting. So whoever put other, if you can just drop in the chat box what your setup is, that would be fascinating to hear. Okay, for those, I think that's pretty much everybody. Give it 1 more minute, then you can just close that and share the results. So thank you for all of you. So it looks like we have a majority who do not have boards right now. So let's try and convince you that it's a really good thing to think about. Those of you who've got directors and shareholders executives is also quite a large group. And I really want to demonstrate that it's actually critical from a value perspective, and also from just generally getting a better job done to have non-exec directors on the board. And it sorts out a lot of the issues that typically happen when it's all shareholders or executives or both in the boardroom. So thank you for that. Okay, so, whoops, I'm struggling with my slides here. There we go. I'll just get some of these windows out of the way. So why aren't you getting value? So let's just dig into that. And one of the key things which is well worth working out is, what phase of growth are you in your business? So is the business quite young, quite new, in that sort of creativity phase? And I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. Then you know you've grown through that. Now you're getting some kind of clear direction. You've focused down on your products and service and not trying to be everything to everybody. Then you start getting into the phase where you're delegating responsibilities away from the founders to other members of your team. And now then you start getting to very much more sophisticated businesses where it's different business units and you're in the coordination phase. The delegation, the majority of it has happened, and now you've got all these different teams operating. Now you've got to try and coordinate them. And then it gets into phase 5, is when you've got a sizable organization, and really it's about working and collaborating with other people in your industry, other different businesses where you can get synergies, etc., etc. So it's much broader than anything that you could control as an individual or as a small team. And it typically looks like this. So this is the 5 phases of growth. This came from Grenier in 1994, but there are other versions of it and other ways of displaying it. And what I'm trying to get to really is that if you are in that space of being small, young, and it might be mature, but still quite small, but it's very much, if you are growing through your own creativity or the creativity of the founders, then you're likely to find that a board's not going to add much value. So either you're growing through that stage and you need to start planning and thinking about what we'll talk in a little bit about the 3 hats means, or if you want to stay there, then start to understand the game rules of that type of business. And once you've made that decision, then stick with it, because it's very much a sort of a T-junction kind of decision. So as you move through the growth phases, then you move into this growing through delegation, growing through coordination, and that's very much more in the space where a board can add value. So I suppose that's the sort of first self-reflection exercise of where you're at right now, is where are you on that growth trajectory? Because you're going to really struggle to get proper value from a board or non-exec directors if you're still in that creativity phase, because it's all about your skill and ability at that point, your way of presenting, delivering, etc., your product or service. So what is that in our world? Well, it's a bit like the games of a solo sport versus a team sport, and we talk about the difference between a craft and an enterprise. So a craft is a one-man show, very much about creativity, typically shows up as being a small business with maybe one outlet, a small office with only a few supporting team members, that kind of thing. That's very much the sort of craft, and it's a mindset and it's a position or place on the growth trajectory. in order to move to that retail store, that bigger business, that multiple branches, that multiple leaders in an organization, etc., which is what an enterprise is, you need to consciously do it. And you need to go through the process of appointing people with that in mind. So it's, as I said, it's a T-junction. Go the craft route, play that game. It's not going to add massive value if you have a board, or go the enterprise route. Then you really need to start thinking about the three hats of shareholder, director, and manager. And there's a video that I did, or webinar I ran on the 16th of July that goes through that in a lot more detail. So again, I'm not going to cover it now, but definitely worth working out. Where are you on that, the growth phases? And are you building a craft? Then play by the game rules of a craft, like playing a solo sport, or you're going in the enterprise route and then play by the game rules of an enterprise and start thinking and understanding about the difference of the three hats and the directors, etc., 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 which we'll talk a little bit more about now. So what are the sort of common issues we come up with or come up against that are mentioned when we're talking to clients and prospects? And what is the desired outcome of this thing? You've made the decision. We're going for this enterprise route. We realize and understand that we've got directors, or we need to get extra directors. So what does that desired outcome look like? And the common issues are typically things like decision making's too slow. We don't make decision at all in some cases. Too operational, no time for strategy. We don't have specific meetings to talk about strategy. It's all about the doing, heads in, definitely in the weeds, not putting our heads up and having a look outside of the bigger world. Majority shareholder says what the majority shareholder says goes. And that's thinking about that craft mindset. If the business is driven still by the majority shareholder and what they think is the best way forward, then that business is operating very much in a sort of craft kind of space. And then everybody comes from the same background. So I want to talk a little bit more about moving into the space where you have much more diversity at board level, possibly than you might have in the rest of the organization, and why that's so important. So decision making too slow, it's typically something to do with poor process. So we'll cover what a best practice process might look like. We don't make decisions at all. Well, often if you get stuck, and this tends to happen in a lot of the corporate boards, we get stuck in the compliance tick box process, and we never actually formulate proper discussions and decisions and move forward. So it tends to be, look at the financials, check we haven't broken any rules and we've done all the things we're supposed to do, and move on. Too operational, no time for strategy. So generally that is a problem because we're not thinking about the three hats properly. We're not thinking about what the role differences are between those three hats. I would argue that if the majority shareholder is dominating a directors meeting, then it's probably you need to start with getting a different chairperson, because that should be part of their job to control who's speaking when and who has a voice and to make sure everybody's perspective is heard. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. And then everyone comes back from the same background. So there's sort of whole group think. We come from the same schools, we live in the same areas, we have the same culture, we have the same religion possibly. We tend to think in a particular way. And it's in a board we need to make sure that we have much more diversity across ways of thinking, ways of acting, cultures, backgrounds, etc., 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 so that we can make better decisions and that we're more in line with what's going on in our markets, what's going on in our countries, and what's going on with our clients. So this is the definition that we have as Serdar of a high-performance director. So high-performance director is one who's obsessed with creating meaningful economic and potentially social impact through their role on the board and the role their company plays in the economy. And furthermore, such a director is not afraid to have the tough conversations as well as do the mundane aspects that together enable board success. So as we'll talk about in a little while, if you are a shareholder and a director and a manager, and so is everybody else in the room in your board, then it's really difficult to have those tough decisions, because it's always someone in the room's fault or perceived fault for how we got here. So it's very difficult to step back, look at something objectively, and then work through the problem, because our emotions kick in all the time and confuse the story and confuse the conversation, and emotions rise and fall and people get upset and get defensive and all of that kind of thing. So it's just so much more difficult to have those conversations if everybody in the room was involved in how we got to that point, or has got something to lose if we change something, or is going to have to do a lot more work if we do something differently. So just bear in mind that, not afraid to have the tough conversations. And ultimately, we want to make sure that we've got well-trained, skilled, the right profile, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well, in the room, so that we have the right people in the room. Because as a board, it's one that, through its rhythm, decision-making, so we mentioned process, holds the company accountable to performance standard higher than it's ever had before. And again, if you're wearing all of those hats, that's just so much more difficult to do. That accountability is really tough. And that results in increased value, improved return for shareholders and other stakeholders on a sustainable basis. And two of the companies I've been working with in the last couple of years have seen massive growth. And really, we hadn't fundamentally changed anything about the way they ran their business, but we've definitely changed the way the leaders think and act, and got a lot more input at that board level about how to move forward and how do we build a strategy that makes sense and caters for all of these different variabilities that are coming at us all the time, from COVID, wars, etc., etc. So that thought of holds the company accountable to a higher performance standard that's ever been had before. So let's get into the value killer number one. We're wearing the wrong hats. So typically this is because we actually don't know which hats we're wearing, and we don't know what the difference of the roles and responsibilities are of these different hats that we're wearing. So we have shareholders, we have directors, a board of directors, and we have management. So the reason why we've got this in the diagram, shareholders, different colored blobs, different shapes of blobs, different sizes of blobs, is because shareholding is purely down to how many shares you own. So you can have more than someone else, less than someone else. You may be involved in the business, you may not be involved in the business, you may never have been involved in the business. So a shareholder could have come from anywhere and could have any range of voting power from 1 to 100. So it's a different animal from the board, which is a much smaller team. They've been appointed specifically because of their skills and abilities, and their ability particularly to run strategy and think strategically and make decisions. And then you have the management, which is still that sort of hierarchy typically, because it works. It's been proven in all kinds of different setups and institutions and organizations that hierarchy, when set up properly, works. And at the top of the management cycle, I would highly recommend that you only have one CEO or MD if possible. It really complicates things if you have joint CEOs. And I've lived through that experience with one board I worked on a few years ago, where we just struggled with who was accountable for what, because they're supposed to be the same, but actually someone has to take responsibility and make a decision in one area, and then who's making the decisions in other areas, etc., etc. So the critical thing to understand, and this is where the first sort of complication comes into this process, shareholders and the board are separate, distinctly separate. So shareholders have a basket of rights. They own a share in the company, and that gives them various rights. So it gives them the right, if it's in the shareholders agreement because they have enough shareholding, gives them the right to be involved in the nomination of directors and the removal of directors. And in all cases, unless it's preference shares or some other funny construct, if it's an ordinary share, shareholders have the right to return on their investment. They've put something in and they expect something back. But it doesn't give them the right to get involved in the strategy of the organization. That's why shareholders appoint directors. Directors run the strategy. Shareholders can provide a statement of intent to say, this is what we need or want to get back on our investment. These are the limitations of what you can do as an organization, but that's it. So you're reporting back to shareholders once, maybe twice a year, maybe a short note once a month if you want to do that, but it's a formal meeting once a year. As soon as shareholders start getting involved in directorship decisions, they break that curtain. They start having issues with the limitation of liability disappears. So if any issue happens, it goes all the way to the top and you can lose everything. The whole point of a limited company is to limit liability. But if you're, as a shareholder, not separating the hats, then you completely lose that limit of liability. It's also very confusing for the operational teams when they don't know whether the decision or the leadership is coming from someone who's the majority shareholder or someone who's the MD. So again, it's really important to keep those separate. The board then has a relationship with management, so it's a dotted line because there's much more information flow that's going up and down, but they are still separate and distinct, and they have different roles and responsibilities. And they all have a relationship with the company. So the relationship between the company and shareholders tends to be quite selfish because I'm expecting a return on my investment. I'm going to be thinking about what am I going to get out of this relationship. I own this many shares, therefore I'm expecting X percentage of the profits. Directors is completely different. It's a totally selfless relationship with the company. As a director, I should be doing everything in the best interest of the company I'm serving on the board of. Not myself, not my family, not the shareholders, the company. And that can be difficult if you've got a lot of the board that are wearing all the different hats. And management is even more complicated because you've got a two-way relationship. There's some kind of contract. So I need to deliver on the contract, which is a selfless part, but I'm going to get some kind of reward, return, remuneration, salary, which is the selfish part. Because if it's not enough or it's not paid on time, then my selfish emotions tend to kick in. So as you can hope you can see from this diagram, it's really important to understand which hat we're wearing and which meeting we're in. Are we having a shareholders meeting when we're discussing what is the return we expect from this organization and the overall very high level direction of this organization? Are we having a board meeting where we should be talking about strategy and we should be demonstrating leadership and doing everything selflessly? Or are we wearing a management hat? This is an exco meeting, this is an operational meeting. We're talking about the nuts and bolts of making this business work. So there's a reason why for other companies, if we're buying a share of a company on the stock exchange, we innately know that it's probably not a good idea for that company to be run by one person or even two or three people. It needs to have some kind of structure. Yet when we're looking at the business that we run, what we call our own business, we treat that investment differently. So it's really important. So if you're going to move into this enterprise space, to start understanding and pull those apart, because that's typically what causes problems and means that the board at the end of the day is completely powerless because shareholders are just going round the board. Management and shareholders just have these conversations with each other and make decisions, and nothing really goes through the board of any meaningful way. So get that right, get the share split right, and now the board can start to operate and can start to actually add value. So the second one, I'd say, I'm not sure about the order of the rest of them, but definitely in my experience, it makes a huge difference if you have the right chairperson. And what I mean by the right chairperson is that they are truly independent and they're a non-exec director. So they're not being pulled in any other direction by thinking with a shareholder hat on. They haven't been involved in operations before. They're not a consultant to the company. So there's no other vested interest in making decisions in a particular way. They have to have a high EQ. And I'll just go through a list of what are the particular things that we think of when we're talking about high EQ of someone who's sitting on a board. But they need to be at a level of maturity where they're not going to get caught up in the arguments. They're going to be able to stay calm. You're going to be able to have the conversation and be persuasive and influence the conversation so it actually gets to a meaningful conclusion and doesn't just spiral around and not go anywhere. They need to be able to bring their life experience, and particularly in a private or family business, it's a lot about mentorship. So I've been here, I've done that. That was the mistake I made. It really doesn't work. Don't go down that road. It's just painful and expensive and all the rest of it. Bring your life experience into the boardroom so you can help to guide this team to get the results they need much more quickly, much less painfully and much more cost effectively. And then it's timekeeping. So the chairman's critical role is managing the meeting, making sure things get covered off when they're supposed to get covered off, and then summarize. So at the end of each section, you start to bring the pieces together. You have defined action items, you have defined resolutions where the wording makes sense, you read it back to everybody, all of those kind of things. Critical aspects of a good chairman. So looking at that non-exec director piece, it's very much separated from executive directors, and it's in that independent non-exec director arm. King 4 and various other government governance codes talk about the sort of ideal makeup of the board, and we would definitely advocate that it's worth thinking about. So you should have the majority of the board is non-executive directors, of whom the majority is independent non-exec directors. So in real terms, what that might look like is you've got a board of 5, 3 are non-exec directors. One of those is a non-exec director. In other words, they're not employed by the company, but they have some kind of relationship with the company. 2 of them are independents, and we'd absolutely recommend that at least one of them is the chairman. And then on the executive side, you've typically got the CEO, managing director, and whoever's in charge of finance. And if they're the same person, then you may bring someone else in as an executive director. But it's really critical to have a different setup in the boardroom from anywhere else in the organization. So it's very definitely a meeting of directors, and you're all focused on doing the work of directors, not getting sort of pushed and pulled into other different hats. So it does not represent a shareholder, no direct or indirect interest for at least 3 years they haven't been employed by the company. And I would advise, if you can, never appointed or employed by the company, not a family member or executive or linked to any kind of trust or those kind of things, not a professional advisor. So you can't count your lawyer or your accountant as independent, and free from any other contractual relationship that means that they're going to be potentially making decisions that are conflicted, and does not receive any remuneration for company performance. Difficult sometimes to get right, but that is a true definition of independence. Versus the executive, where it's very much day-to-day management, full-time salary, intimate understanding of the business. That's what you want to get from the executive director, and entrusted with developing and producing the papers that tell that story truthfully, accurately, completely, etc. It's a key part of that role, but obviously very different from a non-exec director, because they just don't have that insight. And that difficulty of being the executive on the board is that balance between the hats. What's in the best interest of the company, not what's in the best interest of me and my workload and my salary and all of the other things that you might be thinking about. And high EQ, so assertive, enthusiastic, persuasive, stable. They're not all over the place. Patient, good listener, systematic, detailed. If the chairman's not going through the board papers in a lot of detail, then who is? So it's up to the chairman to call out people who haven't been reading the board papers, who haven't thought and digested the discussion, conversation, or content before they come into the meeting, etc., and are careful. Being a director is about care, skill, and diligence, and as chairman, you must lead that careful piece, because ultimately you are managing that team and making sure they're doing a good job. And as we said, life experience, timekeeping, and summarizing. So number 3, wrong directors. So you've got the chairman right, but are the rest of the team really the best people you could have in the room? So the way we look at it from a general recruitment, so any recruitment, whether we're employing someone into our team, whether we're employing someone onto a board, we look at the profile of the individual. So the preference tool we use is contribution compass. We then look at the values and attitude fit. So have you actually defined the values that you want from your organization or within your organization, the culture? And then are you interviewing against those values for general staff and very particularly for directors? And thirdly, have they got the skills? And too often we focus on the skills part and we forget about the other two, or we don't do it as comprehensively as we should. And if we can't get it right in the boardroom, then there's a likelihood we're probably going to be making similar mistakes in the rest of the organization. So the profiling tool we use is Contribution Compass, and it's about understanding the energy of the individuals. So for example, are you the kind of person that's highly activating, which means you're going to pushing change often? Or are you inspiring, which means you're going to be focused much more on the growing the people, the team. It's much more of a rah-rah, come on guys, we can do this kind of energy. Sustaining is about taking the ideas that have been generated by the activating and the inspiring and then working out how we're going to actually implement them. And often boards are missing that sustaining energy, and also unless they've got a really strong financial person that actually has a voice in the room and is not just presenting reports, the other piece that's typically missing is that refining energy. So it's the analysis, the precision, the facts, the data, what is it telling us? Now in a board, you need representation of all of those pieces, because where else can you put it in the organization? Where else do you need to be thinking about all of those aspects when you take the organization forward? So it's about the why, the what, the who, the when, where, and the how. If we cover all of those questions off in that team, naturally, we're not forcing it. We don't have to be disciplined. It's just the way we are. So-and-so asks, typically thinks about the what question. So-and-so is always thinking about what's the impact the client, etc. Someone else is always thinking about whether the timing's right, were we going in the right direction, are we going to the right country, the city, etc., etc. And then lastly, you've got someone who's really looking at the data and digging into it and saying, actually, how are we going to do this? I haven't got any numbers, I don't see a process, you just haven't given me enough information to be confident that we can actually do this. And lack of diversity. So just generally, this is Women's Day, so why aren't we thinking about, why aren't we doing more to bring women onto boards? Because we know independent directors, and particularly women on boards, make a difference. They have a positive impact on the numbers that we want to see, profitability, etc. in a company. EBITDA grows if you have women on the board and if you have independent directors on the board. And if you can have independent women directors on your board, then absolutely the best combination possible. The other thing from a diversity perspective is what I talked about, different upbringings, but it's also different ways of seeing things. So this example is something I found a while ago. It's about what does a deer see? And a deer is red-green colorblind. And this is a picture of a tiger. And from a deer's perspective, it's quite tricky to make out. You've got to have a lot of other things going on. Well, I recognize that sort of shape. That looks like it's the stripes of a something. That leg looks quite powerful. That must be some kind of predator. It doesn't look like it's another antelope, etc., etc. The location means maybe we're in an area where there might be some tigers. But we want people on the board who see this stuff quickly. They see this stuff intuitively. It's just the way their brain's wired to see that danger or see that opportunity. And that's why it's so critical to have diversity of thought, experience, culture, etc., etc. Because we want to see those problems coming ahead of time. We don't want to keep reacting to things. We need to see as far forward as we possibly can. Being a director is all about looking forward, whereas typically we get stuck in the operations, which tends to be focused much more on the now. So we've got to find those individuals that see the things that we can't see, which means they have to come from somewhere other than where we come from. So we have to seek them out. We need to have to bring them into the team, accept them into the team, accept that diversity, accept that different perspective, and work together, play to each other's strengths. And the reason why it's so important is because of this whole idea of variety and changing environments and needing to be able to control the variables of variety, which is the number of possible states of a system. So if you have more people in the team that can help deal successfully with all this diversity and these different challenges, because they are looking at the problems from different perspectives, they have different experiences that they can bring to play, then you can start to handle that variability. And only variety can absorb variety. So what it means in practice is you put systems in place, processes, procedures, policies, all of that kind of stuff. You build a solid governance architecture to reduce the variety, the variability. Then you increase the variety by looking at the composition of the board. You can also have systems that trigger things if something goes out of whack. You know, you've got red signals and red flags and things that pop up when something's outside the parameters that you expect. So you can't necessarily control it with a system, but you can at least flag that something's happening. And that's how you can start to control a lot more variability. And we've had a massive amount of variability and variety and challenges in the last 2 years. So one of the mechanisms for dealing with that is making sure you have a much more diverse board. So coming in for a landing, so number 4, poor process. This is pretty straightforward. We believe that you need to have directors, team, and methodology that work together. So the directors must have the skill, they must have experience, all the stuff we've talked about. They must operate as a team, but they must also have a team. So are the executives trained up to understand how they present information to the board? How do they take the information from the board and disseminate it to the rest of the organization? Has the managing director or CEO had the training to understand how you act as the conduit between those teams to get best value, so that we move information efficiently and effectively between these two critical teams? And part of that is the methodology and process. So this is the way we do things around here. These are the templates we use. This is how we structure our agendas. This is how we structure our board papers. This is the order we do things, etc., etc. Is that methodology piece. So if you don't use one, get one. Serdar spent the last 12 years developing one which we've proved over and over again is really robust. So if you don't have one, then please speak to us and we'll see how we can help you to develop and implement it. And how all of these pieces work together and how you manage to leverage the company performance is because they have very specific roles. So the methodology has to be strong because otherwise you've got nothing to leverage off. The boardroom composition needs to be strong because it's that pivot point. And the directors need to be strong because they're the ones that are applying the force, applying the motion. And if you get all of those right, now you can just shift company performance so much faster. We've got clients that've got 10 times, 20 times, 30 times improvements in profitability in the last 2 or 3 years. Some due to lucky breaks and being part of COVID, but a lot being because they're just doing things much more effectively and efficiently and working together as better as a team and fulfilling the right roles instead of all trying to do all of the same things all at the same time. So as a business grows, you have to be much clearer on these different aspects if you're really going to get the leverage and really help shift that beam, shift that weight, shift that performance of the company as a whole. So for a board process, it's broken down into 3 areas. So climbing analogy, departure, traverse, and regroup. And the departure is about starting the year. So have we done a board evaluation? Have we done some kind of diagnostic assessment of where we are at? Do we have a board charter in place that defines the rules of engagement in the boardroom? So this is how we act. This is our mapping out of roles, responsibilities, culture, all of those kind of things in one place. And it may draw in other different documents as part of it, but it's bringing all of the pieces that are specifically to do with the board into one place. So reference the MOI, shareholders agreement, etc., etc. Delegation of authority. How are we then handing? So we're talking about the teams that communicate between the directors and the management team. How do we then hand over the responsibility to deliver? You do that through a delegation of authority. So what does the board make decisions on? What does the CEO make decisions on? And what do all the other layers of the organization make decisions on? So people can be responsible. And a calendar, so you've mapped out the year ahead. So pre-board meetings, what does the agenda look like? What do the board reports look like? Are they consistent? Are they make sense? Are they summarized properly, etc.? There's all of the things that happen in the meetings and between the meetings. And then do we have minutes that come out immediately after the meeting that we then review quickly before we've all forgotten what happened, etc., etc. And it makes a massive difference if you get this stuff right. And then each year, you can have a sort of regroup, look at the annual financial statements, we do our audits, we build our plan, and we do a board and director evaluation. How did we do? We do it for our teams. Why on earth don't we do it for our boards? We have our annual general meeting, check in with the shareholders. What do you think of the performance for the last year? And what do you think of our plans for the future? And then review all your policies. If you can do all of those things, you will see the needle shift dramatically in terms of effectiveness of the board and the performance of the organization as a whole. And the last piece is really, what does the board do? Well, it does strategy. What is it for? The role is about being in charge of strategy, owning the strategy, being the leaders in the organization, be the people that the rest of the organization looks up to and say, okay, they are living by our values, they understand the strategy, they're communicating effectively, and they're following good process. They're following good governance process. That's what we want from a board. The CEO, yes, contributes to the strategic conversation. Other members of the team, yes, contribute to the strategic conversation, but the board must own it because the board needs to hold the rest of the organization accountable to actually deliver on that strategy. And all the different components of strategy are made up by what we've called the governance compass. Links to the contribution compass, if you put the one over the other, then it talks to what types of personalities particularly perform well in these particular strategic sectors. But it's important to understand that as a board, every year we should be at least reviewing all of these sections because they're all important. They all make a difference to the performance of the business. And naturally they flow in a circle, but life is life and you'll be jumping around between different ones based on which is most important. But if you get the strategy right, then the next thing you need to do is get the culture right. Now you've got some understanding of what the right leadership might look like because you're talking about culture and direction. So is someone able to take us in that direction? Have they got the right culture fit? Now we can look outwards, stakeholder engagement, etc. So as a board, it's really important in the meetings we know and understand how to talk about all of these areas and think about all these areas from a strategic perspective and come up with plans and make decisions to take them forward. And what is governance? So it's policies and procedures. That's really what it comes down to. So once you've defined the strategy, once you're demonstrating leadership, then how do you implement that in the business? You set the rule book. It doesn't have to be massively complicated, but it's really useful to have simple policies, simple procedures, so the rest of the organization now knows what to do. And you don't have to keep telling them over and over, this is how we do things, because it's in the book. This is how we do things around here. So becoming a value-adding, high-performance director requires time, energy, and guidance. And it's ultimately that commitment to your own development. No one else can do this for you. And it's much more than just reading a book. It's much more than taking an exam and going to a lecture. You need to actually do it, test it, review what worked well, what didn't. So it's much more of a self-reflection process if you want to become a better director than just learning something and regurgitating it. It's about living it, it's about being mature, it's about all of those other aspects that we've talked about. So in summary, understand which hat you are wearing and ensure that you have the right chairperson in your board. If you don't have a board, then maybe that's the first, or if you're thinking of setting up a board, then maybe getting an independent chairperson is the first thing you need to think about. They could start off as an advisor, then ultimately move into becoming a fully fledged director or on the board at some stage in the future. But I seriously recommend getting someone who can coach you, mentor you, help hold that space and have those conversations at that level so that you can move the organization forward. And build the board consciously. So who do we need in the room? We can't just bring all of the executives into the room and think that's going to work. It might work, but most of the time it doesn't work because you need to not be promoted into the board, you need to be appointed to the board. Are you a strategic thinker? Do you have the level of EQ and all of the rest of it, skills and abilities to be able to serve the company effectively at that level? And a lot of people just want to stay in operations. They don't want to have to think about big picture stuff and this really scary stuff about strategy and how we're going to spend the money, etc. So build the board consciously, find the non-exec directors when you're ready, but rather do it earlier than later. Then implement best practice governance. So just start with a process. So how are we drawing up our agenda? Does it start with strategy? Are we mentioning strategy regularly? Are we reviewing strategy regularly? Or are we just talking about the matters arising and then maybe a quick glance at the financials? Are we making decisions? Are we presenting the decision papers and discussion papers in such a way that we can go back to them months or years later and see how we got there? How did we make that decision? Why did we make the call the way we did? And then develop a sound strategy and deliver on it. So map it out, draw it up, cover all the 8 bases, think it through and own it from a board perspective, and then communicate to the rest of the organization on how they're going to deliver it. And just really sort of rounding it up, how can we help you? So we offer training, open programs and bespoke training. We offer support services to help you find and appoint directors, which I know finding independent non-exec directors is really difficult. We do ongoing board support and company secretarial, so we'll help run the board with you. To develop that growth in efficiency and effectiveness often takes a lot of hand-holding and regular, as I said, reviews, changing things up, change things up, and that happens much better in a sort of hand-holding, retainer kind of basis than a consulting, here's the report, cheers, see you later. So that's one of the reasons why we've chosen Sirdar as a name, but also we found that it's much more effective if it's a partnership kind of arrangement rather than a consulting kind of arrangement. Do your board evaluations. Again, if you need someone independent to do a board evaluation, we can help you with that, and a full governance diagnostic, absolutely on our list. And the new sort of entrant, I suppose, in the last year or so has been electronic board papers, and we recommend a product called Onboard. So again, if you want to find out more, then please let us know. And for the education perspective, we've got the Applied Directorship program starting on the 24th of March, which is our 11-month comprehensive program. So if you really want to make a difference to your understanding and your, I suppose, going from faith to absolute belief and knowing about what you're supposed to do in a boardroom, then Applied Directorship program is the best course I've come across, and all of the people who've done the course and that left the testimonials has basically said something similar. It's changed the way they think about governance. It's changed the way they act in a boardroom. People have noticed the change in performance of the teams they're working with and the boards they're working with because they've done the course. So if you really want to learn how to do this stuff properly, then I highly recommend that 11-month course. If you're not sure, you just want a bit more insight into what we've talked about today, then we've got a one-day workshop that happens pretty much every month, and the next one's on the 23rd of March. Sign up for that. Gives you an intro. It's only one day, and it certainly gives you an idea of, okay, what am I going to do next? Where are the gaps? What are the kinds of things I need to be thinking about as I grow my business? And I'm offering, if anybody interested, a free 30-minute consult. So if you just don't know what to do next, then happy to jump on a call, and we'll probably do it on Zoom or Teams or something. Jump on a call, spend a few minutes just talking through where you're at, and then hopefully I can just give you some guidance on what to do going forward. And that's my email address. Either pop something in the chat to say 30-minute consult please, and Firdous will pick that up, or send me an email after the session and we'll take it from there. So thank you very much. I'll open to questions now. In the meantime, I'm just going to put a poll up. Firdous, if you can just stick that up at the end, just to close out and give me some indication of next steps. So it could be one or many. It's up to you. And if you want us to call you about anything, send you more information, then please let us know. So any questions? Did anything come up on the chat or Q&A for those? I haven't seen anything. I'm just looking at some of the different industries various people have come from. I'm really pleased to see that there is such a broad range of industries on the registration list, because the same governance rules apply regardless of what industry you're in. And also, I'd highly recommend, if you're bringing a non-exec director into your company, then don't pick someone from your industry, because you, as the management, as the people who've built this business, should have the best understanding of how your industry works. What you need help with, or might need help with, is understanding how a business works and how a business can grow to the next level. So bring in someone who has been to that level, who can see what it looks like, can understand the challenges at the next level, and look back and say, look, I can help pull you up this mountain, I can help pull you up this slope because I've been there before. They're coming back down to help you rather than being on the journey of sort of thrashing your way, trying to get to the next level with you. So think about those kind of things when you're appointing a director. It's very much about, have they been there before, but not so far ahead that they've possibly forgotten what those challenges and pain points were at your level. And yeah, so hospitality, retail, manufacturing, all the same potential challenges and the same construct. So it doesn't matter what type of company you're running, charity, not-for-profit or fully on-for-profit, IT, etc. Ultimately, to take your business to the next level, you need to think about formalizing a board, because from the very day you register the company, you have a board. You have at least one director. So you need to make sure you're using that construct, that role properly, and bring in those second or third directors or fourth directors and do it properly, because it really, really adds immense amount of value. So thank you for all of those who filled in the questionnaire or the next steps. We will be sending out follow-up emails with the recording. And it's the preparation at base camp, not during the climb, that gets you to the summit. So do the homework, do the training, prepare, and it'll help you enormously in take your business to the next level. So thank you. We've got a couple of minutes left. If there's any last questions, maybe just, you don't need to share the results if you don't want to for those, otherwise we can just keep it. Thank you for attending. I hope that was valuable. I hope you've had some insights that maybe change the way you think. That's my goal, is to change the way people think and take your business to the next level. And we're here when you're ready, whether it's now or in a few years' time. Once you've got the business to the point where you need our help, then just give us a shout. So thanks very much. Keep well and have a great afternoon.